Welcome to another podcast of Mad in Love. And for those who are new to this podcast, I'd like to quickly introduce myself. I'm Dr. David Hawkins, the clinical director of the Marriage Recovery Center and the Emotional Abuse Institute. And a quick sidebar, you're going to see a different setting. Yes, I'm not in the snow country or cold country of Washington State. I'm in Mexico temporarily. But anyway, I'm passionate even here about helping individuals and couples overcome emotional abuse and to engage in healthy relationships. Over the years as a therapist, I've worked with a lot of couples who really struggle with emotional intimacy and heavy topic that we're going to dive into today, sexual addiction. My field happens to specialize with clients who have struggles with narcissistic abuse, narcissism, emotional abuse, but there's a vast percentage that tends to also struggle with sexual addiction. So it is incredibly important that we discuss this topic in length. And to that point, today we have a special guest, and that is I'm joined by Dr. Greg Miller, who I had the privilege of just running into at a professional conference, and he is from Faithful and True Counseling Center. I'm going to have him introduce himself, but I have heard about Faithful and True, Dr. Miller, for a long, long time, and we're just excited to have you. And we're with that, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us about yourself. And
okay. Well, thank you.
Tell us about
and thank you for the invitation. Yeah, it's great to be here. And as you mentioned, I am a part of the Faithful and True team. Faithful and True is located in Minnesota, right outside of Minneapolis in one of the suburbs. And it was founded by Dr. Mark Laser and Debbie Laser.
Of course.
And Mark was a leading speaker in the field of sex addiction and specifically working with a Christian audience. Mark wrote a book about 30 years ago, Healing the Wounds of Sexual Addiction. And what made that book so significant was that he used the principles of recovery that he had learned in his own journey of recovery, but he also included his faith and he also included his own story. And so those three things, principles of recovery, his own story, and his own faith journey, really have made it a foundational book for him, for others in the field of sex addiction. And it's the principle that we continue to use here at Faithful and True in 2022. And we want to focus on the principles of recovery, good clinical practices, as well as understanding our own story and the impact that that's had in our own journeys of recovery, as well as our faith and the role that our faith has had for us. And so with that, many of those on the team lead out of their own stories. I myself am on a journey of recovery from sex addiction. My wife and I are a part of the Faithful and True team. And so we teach, we lead out of our own experiences, which was modeled by Mark and Deb at the very beginning.
You know, Dr. Miller, that's such a great introduction. And I want everybody to really grab a hold of this idea that we are professionals. This is the field of sexual addiction now. We're not newbies in discussing these kinds of issues. Sexual addiction now is, we all know that it happens. We know that drug abuse happens. We know that alcohol abuse and addiction happen. We know that sexual addiction, gambling addiction, there's all, I don't want to get off on too much of a tangent, but we're all addicts. The whole world,
Yes.
The whole world is overly attached to something. But anyway, Faithful and True Ministries, your own story. Tell us a little bit about what Faithful and True does. And, we're celebrating you. And like I said, the overlap in your field and my field. So narcissistic abuse, narcissism, emotional abuse. I would say, I was talking to my team, I would say, I would love to hear your numbers on this, but I would say 30 to 50% is a huge number of every referral that we get at the Marriage Recovery Center and the Emotional Abuse Institute struggles with some aspect of sexual addiction. But anyway, tell us more about Faithful and True and what you do.
Okay. So we often refer to the three-legged stool. And with the three-legged stool, we work with men who are struggling with sexual addiction. We work with their spouses, and we also work with couples. And one of the things I just want to say is at Faithful and True, we work exclusively with men who struggle with sexual addiction. And yet what we know is there are a lot of women who struggle with sexual addiction
Mm.
also. It's kind of our field came out of Mark and Deb's story. Mark struggled with sexual addiction. He was married to Deb. The two of them had their own recovery journey, and then they also had their recovery as a couple. And so that's kind of the model that we work with 30 years later is we work with men who struggle, we work with their wives, and we also work with couples. Not too long ago, I did a research project and I specifically included women. So I had a survey that I invited people to take. We had about over 400 people take the survey. We got about 330 usable surveys. And in that,
Wow.
2/3 were men, 1/3 were women. And what we saw was for women who scored high on the sexual compulsivity scale, there wasn't a significant difference between the men and the women. And so I say all of that to say for any of you listeners who it's the wife that may be struggling with sexual addiction or relationship addiction, we know that that's a significant issue. It's just so that's not the population that we deal with. And so we
Okay.
offer workshops. We do a workshop every month for men who struggle with sexual addiction. It's a 3-day workshop. We also do a workshop with wives, so women who are married to sexual addicts. And kind of what you've alluded to is many of the wives who come may not be struggling with sexual addiction, but they also have their own coping strategies or in some cases their own addictions that they're bringing to the relationship. And we often talk about the fact that in a relationship where someone is struggling with addiction, they are completely responsible for the addiction. One of the things, especially early on, that we want men to get out of the habit of doing is in some way blaming their wife or blaming their marriage for their addiction. What we know is their addiction predates their marriage. And so
Ah,
we often say, you are completely responsible for your addiction. And each of you make contributions to the relationship, what is good and what is chaotic. And we want to take ownership for what we're doing that contributes to the chaos. And as a wife, you are not responsible for the addiction. And we also work with couples. One of the things that we know is early in disclosure, when a woman just finds out about the sexual addiction, she may not be ready yet to work on the marriage. And yet there are some practical things that need to be addressed in the coupleship. So we want to support them as a couple as they navigate that early chaos. And then in time, when they're ready to work on the coupleship, we want to provide the support that they need at that point.
so excellent again, Dr. Miller. Tell us about what are some different aspects of sexual addiction. I mean, there are probably many, but I'm guessing that, for every 100 men that come through your program, I'm betting there's a huge clump that center. What comes to my mind, I'd love to hear you expand on this, but I'm thinking about pornography, of course. I'm thinking about massage parlors, of course. I'm thinking about affairs, of course. I'm thinking about, anyway, any number of other aspects. But is that kind of when you put it in a bell-shaped curve, is it like pornography, massage parlors, affairs? Is that the big clump of
Right.
them? But anyway, take it away.
Yeah. Okay. So when you're looking at behaviors, those really are the behaviors that we're identifying. Kind of the way that we talk about the workshop is our workshop is for any man who, because of the choices he's making in the area of sexuality, he is hurting himself and others. He's creating chaos for himself and others. And on his own, he's been unable to stop. One of the issues of addiction is it's not what I'm doing, but it's why I'm doing it. The way I talk about addiction occurs anytime you're trying to meet a legitimate need in an illegitimate way in a repetitive pattern. And what's driving the addiction is the legitimate need that is not being met. I often heard Mark Glazer ask the question, when did sexual arousal become the solution to your problems? And typically it was the first time you were introduced to some sort of sexual experience as a little boy or a little girl, and you experienced the neurochemical reaction of sexuality that temporarily relieves you from your anxiety, your fear, your chaos, whatever it might be. And so if addiction is trying to meet a legitimate need in an illegitimate way in a repetitive pattern, recovery is identifying the legitimate need and meeting the legitimate need in a legitimate way. And what we see is when men are able to identify the legitimate need and meet it legitimately, then the power of the addiction begins to fade. And so there are three principles that we teach about sex addiction. The first one is sex addiction is not about sex, it's about how you use sex. And a lot of times in our recovery, we're focusing on the behavior. And what we will tell a man is if you have a destructive behavior, we need to do everything we can to support you to stop that behavior as quickly as possible. So we are going to talk about some behavior modification. We're going to talk about accountability or accountability software or filters on your computer. We're going to talk about behavioral change. But what we also know is if you're not understanding what's driving the behavior, you're not going to be able to change long term.
I want to pause you there, Dr. Miller. So you're dialing me up right now, and I bet you dial up a lot of professionals. Here's how you're dialing me up, and I'm open to that. I'm thinking about this all wrong. So let's take alcohol addiction. I have been saying for many, many, many years, it's not really a reasonable question to ask a late stage alcoholic, why are they drinking? They're drinking because they're a late stage alcoholic and they've been doing it for 30 years. And now to ask them why back when they were 23 years old, why they used it and abused it and abused it. But is it fair to say that somebody who's 50 or 60 years old, is that still a reasonable thing for us to do, to ask the question, why are you still overusing this substance or this behavior in the case of sexual addiction? Is that I'm not sure it's been a reason. I haven't thought of it as a reasonable question. I've thought if you're a late stage alcoholic, you're drinking because you've been drinking for 40 years. And it was a good question back when you were 23, but not so good at 60. So help me understand that.
Okay, so I do want to distinguish between substance addiction and behavior addiction.
Okay.
Because I do believe, like the example that you're using with alcohol, is it's not just a neurochemical reaction to the substance. You are actually putting a substance in that is contributing to the neurochemical reaction.
Gotcha. Yep.
So to a behavioral addiction, and again, let's talk about sex addiction.
Yep.
The example that I would use is, let's say you're a little boy, or it could be a little girl, but in our case, you're a little boy, you're overwhelmed by life. Life is just difficult. You know, you go to school, you have to sit still and be quiet. You go to the playground, you don't know if you're going to be chosen for the team. You go to the cafeteria, you don't know where to sit.
Yep.
So it's just difficult. Maybe you go home and in the family, there's conflict or arguments or silence. And so you're a little boy, and what you discover is if you just hold your penis, you start to feel better. You don't know why, but because of the way that God created our bodies and neurochemistry, that there are certain neurochemicals that are released just through touch. So if I touch myself or someone else touches me, beyond my control, there are neurochemicals that immediately I start to feel better. And then what happens is if I stroke my penis, I get an erection. That feels amazing. And I like the fact that I feel empowered. And then if I've gone through puberty and I'm able to ejaculate, I have this amazing orgasm, and all of the neurochemicals that are released there completely orients the way I feel. So suddenly what's happening is I'm a little boy and I'm starting to use masturbation as my pain reliever, my anxiety medication, and also my sleep aid. Now, nobody's told me this.
Yeah.
It's just a natural way that my body is responding. So what happens is the next time I feel anxiety, I remember masturbation. The next time I feel lonely, I remember masturbation. And then you start putting other components with it, like pornography. That's enhancing the experience because now visually I'm seeing something. It enhances the fantasy that I'm having. So now the drug is even stronger. One of the things that we talk about one of the reasons that sex addiction is so powerful is because of the comprehensive nature of sexuality. That when God created us to be sexual, it is a holistic experience. It's about who we are physically, emotionally, relationally, mentally, spiritually. And so when that is misused or not stewarded well, the destruction is comprehensive, but the temporary relief also feels comprehensive. And so here I am now, a 50-year-old man, and I have anxiety. I've never been taught what to do with my anxiety. So I feel anxious. And now what I want to do is ejaculate my anxiety because that's what I did as a little boy. And so the reality is, I do think, especially in the field of sex addiction, that there is still that question of the why.
Okay.
That if all I'm trying to do is stop the behavior, it's like mowing my lawn thinking I'm going to get rid of the weeds. It doesn't work. It looks good for a little while because anything short and green looks good, but eventually the roots of the weeds will take hold and the weeds will return and bring their friends. That's the nature of addiction. It doesn't stay stagnant. It actually gets worse over time.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Well, like I said, you're dialing me up. Let's talk about, we mentioned pornography, we mentioned massage parlors, we mentioned affairs. Why don't you tackle each of those, or maybe just talk about what are the sexual behaviors that come to the forefront most often, and I'm mindful that there's many other variations. There's not
Right.
just anyway. There's any number of variations to this puzzle. But tell us what you see, and like I
Well, I would definitely say that pornography is the thing that drives most people and most men to our workshop initially. That pornography is a significant entry point because of just the availability of it. We talk about four things that define kind of the nature of our acting out. The first one is risk. That one of the things that we're looking for in our sexual experience is some level of risk, because risk is connected to the adrenaline that is a part of the neurochemistry of sexuality. But combined with risk is safety. Everyone who acts out has some sort of definition of safety. What I often talk about, it's not legitimate, wise adult safety, it is addiction safety. And typically, safety for the addict is what I do so I don't get caught. And then the third thing is curiosity. And we talk about the fact that part of the sexual desire is curiosity. That's the question of, I wonder what it would be like to. And sexuality is driven by the energy of curiosity. And then the fourth thing is availability. What is available to me? And so when I was a 10-year-old boy, in some way, my sexual acting out was defined by what was available to me. And that's why we've seen a significant shift with the development of the internet, that availability is now something that is prominent for everyone. Back in the olden days, however you define the olden days, you had to go somewhere. You had to go to the adult bookstore. You had to go to the 7-Eleven or the convenience store, or you had to find your dad's stash of pornography or the loose magazine in the vacant lot. Well, today it is readily available. And because of that availability, it's ramping up some of the components of sexual addiction that we haven't seen in the past. So when we're talking about what are the behaviors, those are still the same factors that are working. And so we see that pornography is the most prominent because pornography is the most available. So if you look at the various things, so the guy who goes to the massage parlor or goes for an erotic massage, he's looking for certain things from his drug. Maybe for him, touch is important. Maybe it's escalated beyond just images, but he needs contact with someone in order for the drug to be more powerful. Because one of the things that is true is over time, we make choices that refine our drug in order to be the most powerful form. Now, one of the things that can limit us is fear. So I often talk to a lot of men, and one of the questions that I talk to them about is not just what did you do, but what did you want to do that you were afraid to do? Because some men have a lot more desire for activity, but their fear or their shame has kept them limited. And so as we're talking about, was it pornography? Was it affairs? many times what determines it is what was available to me, and also what was the thing I was looking for in my drug that I could find in this particular expression. So, for instance, I've worked with a lot of men who never thought that they would have an affair. And they even convinced themselves, oh, I will never have an affair. And they thought it was for moral reasons, but the reality, it was fear. It was their fear that they would be rejected. It was their fear that nobody would want them. It was their fear that they're not desirable or choosable, and the shame that comes along with that. So they perceive that they are safe until someone comes along and express interest in them. And suddenly that fear that was keeping them guarded or protected is gone, and now that door has been opened. So now they're stepping into affairs, and they never thought that they would. So, all of that to say, I think there's a variety of different things that come together uniquely that determine why I act out, when I act out, and the nature of my acting out itself.
And then I presume, by what you've just said, Dr. Miller, I presume that when this man crosses the threshold and discovers an erotic massage parlor, then he'll do it again and again.
Absolutely.
And again and again. And like, and now they might even get an escort when they travel to a different city, and they might this and they might that, and I mean, is that
right.
part of the deal?
Yeah,
too?
because one of the things that we talk about is that addictions are progressive. And the reason they're progressive is because of neurochemical tolerance. So I often use the image. I'm a 10-year-old boy, and this is a very common story that I hear. I'm a 10-year-old boy. I come across a vacant lot. There's this magazine in there with these naked people. I have an immediate reaction because of the way that God has created me neurochemically. I'm drawn to this image. So I tear one of the photos out of the magazine. I take it back to my house. I fold it up. I put it under my mattress, and I look at it. And I do that every day. And for the first several days, it's so exciting. I don't even know what to do. But eventually, the more I look at it, the less satisfying it is, because my brain is adjusting to what it is I'm putting into it. And so that image that was so exciting initially suddenly seems boring over time. And that's then when I go to seek something else. So now I just look at one image. Now I want to go back and have the whole magazine because I want several pictures. Eventually, the pictures are boring. And so now I want to see moving pictures. So I look for videos or DVDs, depending on how old I was. Or maybe I go to the internet and now I'm seeing videos online. And so there is this progression piece. So let's say that I've been looking at images. That's not satisfying. I now want to see live people. So now maybe I go to a strip club because now I'm getting to see people. And one of the things that we talk about is when it comes to a fantasy, all fantasies are rescue fantasies. It doesn't matter what you're fantasizing about. It could be a financial fantasy, a relational fantasy, a professional fantasy, a spiritual fantasy, even a recovery fantasy. If I'm fantasizing, I want to be rescued from something, and I want to be rescued to something. And so what happens is, in order for a fantasy to be powerful, there must be some aspect of reality that's combined with the magical thinking. And the way that I talk about a fantasy is magical thinking combined with reality. And the more reality there is, the more powerful the fantasy is. So now I'm going to a strip club where there are these live people in front of me. There's more reality to it, but I'm still bringing the fantasy and the magical thinking that this experience is going to rescue me. It's going to rescue me from my loneliness. It's going to rescue me from my insecurities. It's going to rescue me from my anxiety, whatever it may be. Well, eventually, the strip club isn't satisfying me. So now I'm wanting human contact. So now I transition into another type of acting out scenario where maybe I have more contact now. So again, it's that progressive belief that next time it is going to satisfy me. And that's one of the things I often say. Every addict has to believe next time it will be different. That's what opens the door to acting out.
Would you have touched on this, touch on it just a little bit more, Dr. Miller, the neurochemistry, because you keep using that phrase that they're chasing the high, and there is a high. It's a
Right.
real deal. So I mean,
Right.
there's I forget the name of the book. There's some book out there that's something like Our Brain on Sex or something like. Anyway,
Right.
I'm not referencing that particular book, but tell us about the neurochemistry. What is going on that just becomes this is powerful. This is a powerful
Right.
deal.
Well, when I often heard Mark Laser say that all sex addicts are drug addicts, it's just that all of the drugs are in their brain. And so there is this arousal process that God created. And so it does involve adrenaline and dopamine and other neurochemicals that are just natural reactions to what is going on. And like I said, there are neurochemicals where just being touched, I get this sense of well being. It's the nurture connection that occurs between a mother and an infant, where just being held, that infant feels safer and connected. Well, that's part of the neurochemistry of sexuality. And so there is this dynamic. And I want to say clearly, I am not an expert in neurochemicals and neuroscience, but I do have enough of an understanding to know that you have neurochemicals of sexuality that are involved, even if you are acting out in an addictive way. In fact, the misuse of those neurochemicals is part of what's driving the addiction.
This is so doggone important, Dr. Miller. It's just so important. And man, in some ways, it just causes me to kind of sit back and go, whoa, this is heavy stuff. It's big stuff. I mean, I knew that alcohol addiction and treatment of alcohol addiction is a big deal. Treatment of drug addiction is a big deal. And this sounds, this is, so your treatment is comprehensive, right? I mean, it's got to be.
And it has to be.
Yeah.
One of the things that we talk about is responding to sexual addiction. There must be a complex response because it's a complex issue. I often say if people offer a simple solution to a complex problem, they just look foolish. And so if we're addressing a destructive behavior, like I said earlier, we have to come up with systems that support the change of that behavior immediately. But what's also true is we also need to be addressing those roots. I mentioned that I did a research project.
Yeah.
And what we began to look at is what are the contributing factors. And one of the things that we saw is early on, about 40 years ago, Patrick Carnes wrote really the first book where he used the term sexual addiction.
Out of the shadows.
And he was the first one to take the principles of recovery and apply it to sexual behavior. And back in the 80s, when he was doing a lot of his research, one of the things that we saw was a lot of this was driven by the pain of abuse and trauma. And if you read his books, you can see that pretty clearly. Well, 40 years later, what we're seeing is a lot of men that are coming through our workshop are saying, I don't know why I'm here. There wasn't a lot of trauma. There wasn't a lot of abuse growing up, or there wasn't any. And what we did is we wanted to explore what is driving the addiction. And so I identified various things, invasion, abandonment, some other factors that contribute to our shame. And in the research, what we saw is actually at some point, the causal event is superseded by the shame in driving the addiction. And so I don't have to have this big story of abuse. I don't have to have a big story of invasion, of abandonment. What I have are these experiences that create shame. That shame then is put into this bucket, and the stronger the bucket of shame becomes, the more it's driving the addiction. In fact, shame is what's driving the addiction, not the earlier pain. In fact, I used to say we've got to heal the pain of the past to get free. What I say now is we have to heal shame that was caused or created from the pain of the past. And the way that I define shame are the lies that we believe about ourselves and the lies that we believe about God. And the way that we deal with shame is we move from shame into the truth of who I am and the truth of who God is. That's what sets me free.
I want you to speak to another. I'm going to kind of overlap our various fields. In the field of treating emotional abuse and narcissism, I have discovered a phenomenon that I just call emotional immaturity, meaning men that are little boys that have a that you know, if you and I were to sit down and kibitz and talk about self-care and dealing with anxiety and relational tension in healthy and effective ways, 100% of the men that I'm working with don't have a clue about how to deal with emotional challenges. You're familiar with dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, and one of the hallmarks of DBT is the ability to tolerate distress. All of the men that I know that are working with don't know how to tolerate distress. They don't know how to manage emotions. I'm imagining this field, your field, is that true equally in your field as well? That these men, part of the attraction of sexual addiction is the high, the anxiety that I feel in my relational tension that I don't have a clue about how to deal with. Now I've just found this substance, this neurochemical. I've discovered it. I've happened upon it. Are there overlaps here? Are these men?
Absolutely.
Are they emotionally immature and emotionally distressed men that don't know how to?
Absolutely.
Yeah, talk about that.
Well, and typically what we see is it goes back to the age where they were first exposed to something sexual. So if I was a 10-year-old and I was first exposed to some sort of sexual material, either through experimentation with my peers or through some aspect of pornography, there is this like stunting of growth at that point because suddenly I've learned a way that I can exit my chaos. I can exit my fear, my sadness, my grief. So I don't have to learn to navigate it. I've learned this skill or this opportunity to escape it. And so now I'm a 40-year-old man using the same skill, but I'm functioning as that 10-year-old because I never learned how to navigate challenges, conflict, stress. And one of the pieces that you're talking about is nurture is modeled. And so
Okay.
self-nurture must be modeled. I must learn how to take care of myself as I see other people taking care of me. So if I grow up in an environment where I'm invaded and I'm abandoned, and one of the things that we say is everybody is invaded, everybody is abandoned. You know, invasion is when something happens to me that shouldn't have happened, and abandonment is when I have a need and that need goes unmet. Well, every child experiences that. So it's not was I, it's to what extent.
Yes.
The child has to learn when I am invaded and abandoned, what skills am I needing in order to move through that in a healthy way? Well, I learn that by watching the people, the adults around me do it. Well, if they're not doing it, I'm not learning how to do it. So I don't know how to do self care because it wasn't modeled for me. I don't know how to healthily navigate challenges or life. I'm modeled to escape, so I know how to escape because the people around me escape. And so part of it is, you know, we often talk about recovery is from the wise adult part of you going back and reparenting that little boy part of you and actually giving him those things that he did not receive so that you can become the wise adult that you need and the people around you need.
Dr. Miller, this is such phenomenal stuff that you're saying, and it is. I unfortunately, I don't know if this is unfortunate, or just is. Boy, the population that we're working with at the Marriage Recovery Center and the Emotional Abuse Institute, when I start talking to them about self-validation, self-nurturance, their eyes start to spin in the back of their head. Self-validation, what in the world is self-validation? Meaning, I was hurt today when my wife walked out of the room and said, I don't care what you're feeling today. Like, I mean, I can validate, I can sit with myself and say, that hurt. That would hurt anyone. I'm hurting. I am wounded. Dr. Miller, they don't know how to do this. So anyway, that's part of your treatment, right? That you
Absolutely.
would teach self-validation. You would teach self-nurturance. You would teach,
Right.
look, you're going to get, just if you're walking through the world and if you're in any kind of relationship, you're going to get wounded. Let's just, anyway,
Right.
talk to us about that. Talk to us about,
Well,
yeah,
you kind of mentioned this, but one of the things that we work on, I often say, I think there are four things that are necessary for emotional and spiritual health. And the first one is self awareness. That so many of the men who come through our workshop, one of the things that they're struggling with is very much what you're saying. They are just not self aware.
right.
And part of it was in the family system that they grew up in, who they were, basic needs, having a voice, those things were not validated. So they're not self aware. They're kind of living without, outside of themselves. The next thing is transparency. So as I become self aware, I'm actually sharing that with other people. I'm including other people in my life. The third thing is ownership, that I'm taking responsibility for my life and my choices. And the alternatives to ownership are blame and shame. You know, blame says it's all your fault. Shame says it's all my fault. And neither one of those are in truth. The key is what's mine is mine and I'm going to own it, but what's not mine, I'm going to release. And then the fourth thing is intentionality. I'm going to live a very purposeful life. Because when the men first show up at our workshops, what we realize is they struggle with self awareness. They are terrified of transparency because one of their
Right,
beliefs
right.
is if you really knew me, you would reject me. They struggle with ownership because they just swing between blame and shame. And they've been living these lives of reaction versus determination and intentionality. And so, as we're working with them, part of it is let's get self aware. What are my needs? You know, if addiction is when I have a legitimate need, but I'm trying to meet it in an illegitimate way, the beginning of recovery is having that self awareness of I actually have a valid need and what are the valid ways I can meet that need.
I'm looking at these four legs to the stool, or I forget how you teed this up: awareness, transparency, ownership, and intentionality. And I'm thinking every person on the planet needs.
Mm-hmm.
I'm
Well, those are four things I'm working on.
exactly. I was thinking check,
We
check,
continue
check,
that journey.
check. I was. Oh, thank you for validating. I'm thinking I'm working on every one of those things. But every man and woman in our programs, we're working on this stuff. Tell us some more about what does treatment look like. So you've teed this up. You've set the stage for this is this is a meeting legitimate needs in an illegitimate way. The neurochemistry of the brain says, I like this. This will help me feel better. Although it then I need more, 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 more. Actually, what is it? I think we all going to know the answer to this, Dr. Miller. What is it that brings a man to your doorstep? I'm assuming that something collapses, that they've taken one risk too many, and boom, they. But anyway, talk to that, and
Yeah.
then let's
Well, you're
talk
right.
about treatment.
I often say one of the benefits of what we do is, for the most part, the people who seek us out are desperate. And I often talk about that desperation is a good short term
Yeah.
motivator,
Yep.
but it cannot be considered a long term motivator.
Yep.
And what we're working on is taking that
I love this.
desperation that the men experience and transitioning that to desire. Because desire is the long term motivator. Once I catch a glimpse of what it is to be in freedom, to be living authentically, to be connected and in healthy, intimate relationships with other people, I'm going to want to have more and more of that. And so one of the patterns that we see is men will show up in the desperation, but desperation is all that they have. And if that's all they have when the desperation fades, they end up back into their addiction. So we want to steward their desperation, but we also want to set them up for the realization that you have to start to find desire. And so we often talk about developing a recovery team. And rarely does anybody recover with only one resource or one thing on their team. And instead of talking about specific resources, I teach these are the components of a recovery team. The first one is a place of truth. Everyone in recovery needs a place where they can be completely open and honest about their story, both choices that they've made and experiences that they've had, because there's so much shame. And one of the reasons that we need a place of truth is by being open and honest, we are actually able to shed the shame that is driving the addiction. One of the things I often say is we also need a place where we can be open and honest about the details, because our shame is in the details. But what's also true is the legitimate need that we're trying to meet in this illegitimate way is going to be found in those details. Kind of the thing that you and I have been talking about. Why do I keep going back to this particular website? Why do I look for this particular thing in an affair
Yep.
partner? Why is this experience powerful, but this experience isn't powerful? Well, I often say pornography is not powerful. What's powerful are the meanings and messages we put on pornography, and
Okay.
the meanings and messages always come from our story. So we need a safe place, a place of truth where we can talk about that. Something else that everyone's going to need is an authentic community. And by authentic community, it is that community where I can be completely open and honest and transparent. I often talk about the last 10%. Like I mentioned, I'm also in recovery. And early in my recovery, I went to a counseling center. And what they often said is the stuff that you're not talking about the most is the stuff that drives you the most. The stuff that you're avoiding, that last 10%, is actually what's driving you. And so you have to have a place, a community, an authentic community of people that you can be open and honest and include that last 10%. Something else that we talk about is that spiritual sacred space. Everybody in recovery needs that place where they can wrestle with God. I love that image from the Old Testament of Jacob wrestling with the angel of the Lord. And if you're going to wrestle with God, you're going to get a new name and you're going to get a limp, because God is going to show up in a powerful and transformative way. And then something else that you're going to need is that emotional space. If I've been using my addiction to medicate my emotions, I have to find a safe space in a healthy way to express my emotion, to be with my emotions. And then we're also going to need an expert voice. Whatever addiction we're struggling with, there are those unique components to that. We're going to need that expert that can help us. And then the final thing in the recovery team is we're going to need that mentor, that coach, that person that's just a little bit further down the road than we are. And the A's, Celebrate Recovery, a lot of places call it your sponsor. But it's so helpful to have somebody that's on the
Oh
journey
my.
just a little bit further ahead of you.
I just like this so much. This is so hopeful. You have you yeah. There's a all of the men and women that we're working with, we talk about this a lot at the Marriage Recovery Center, Dr. Miller, that people are really looking for direction. Tell me, look, just come on, tell me where to go, tell me how to get there. I'm not sure I'll do it, but I'm pretty sure I'll do it. I mean, come on,
Right.
give me, shine the light and give me a path forward. So do you find that as well? Do you find please, just come on, give me the workbook.
Right.
Give me the workbook. Tell me what to read. Tell me what the next step is. Man, I don't like, and it probably is desperation at first, and the
Yeah,
desire
absolutely.
grows. But still, I'm sure you're like me. I'll take a guy any day of the week with that's motivated by desperation. We, we can start there. Good enough.
Absolutely.
Let's start there. But
And I absolutely agree that, especially in the field of addiction, there are a lot of therapeutic modalities where it's more um, uh, passive, more responsive. But I do think in the field of addiction, being more directive, especially initially, is essential. That is what people are looking for. If
absolutely.
somebody is drowning, you want to quickly teach them how to swim by modeling it, demonstrating it, teaching them, giving them directions, versus just talking about the temperature of the water.
Oh
You
my.
know, you want to get in there and provide some direction, because eventually, if they can find enough hope within themselves, that becomes the motivator. Several years ago, a person came and did a PhD study on the workshop that we do. And so they did a pre-test and a post-test for all the participants for about 6 months. And what they discovered in their research was when men left our workshop, they left with more hope and less shame. And I've always thought that is an amazing combination, that they have less shame, more hope, and then one other factor was more openness. Well, if you combine those three things, that can be an incredibly transformational place to begin. And so that early on directive place, again, we're going to teach you how to fish because you've got to feed yourself. But if you're starving, we may do some of the fishing for you initially.
I love this. And Dr. Miller, I mean, this is so hopeful. And people who come and work with us, there's so much, I don't know if it's out there in the field of sexual addiction, in the field of narcissism and emotional abuse. There's so much out there. It really upsets me. There's so much out there that says, oh, there's no hope. Come on. It's, look, if you're an addict, if you're a narcissist, if you're emotionally abusive, game over, run, don't. But I'm sure you would say, look, come on, walk through the door, just walk through the door. We'll greet you. Let go of shame, and we've got a protocol. We've got a treatment plan that can help you. It will help you. It's tried and true. I guess true and it's true and faithful.
And what's also true is for a lot of people, getting identified as an addiction or getting diagnosed as an addict is incredibly painful. It feels like the end of the world. It feels like there's this despair. But the reality is, if I have a proper diagnosis, then I can get the proper treatment plan that absolutely leads to transformation. One of the worst things is to not have a diagnosis, even though you have a condition, and you're just kind of shotgunning it, trying to figure out what might work. That's what leads to despair. But if I've got a clear diagnosis, then I can develop a treatment plan. And I think one of the things that makes Faithful and True so powerful is many of us on staff are in our own journey of recovery. My wife and I worked together. Mark and Deb, for years prior to Mark's death, worked together. We have other couples who have navigated this. So when we talk about the fact that there is hope, it's not because we read it in the book, it's because we experienced it. When we talk about this is a difficult journey, it's because we've walked a difficult journey. But in the midst of that, there is hope because of the transformation that we've experienced. And one thing I would say is, if someone is in a place where there is no hope, they are not living in truth. I often say, one of the things that we have to do is to be able to right size it. And we want to take it seriously. And for many people, one end of the pendulum is they minimize it. And if they're minimizing it, that's not going to serve them. But the other end of the pendulum is we catastrophize it. And if we catastrophize it, one of the ways we can know we catastrophize it is there's no hope. Well, if there's no hope, we're not in truth. If we're minimizing it, we're not in truth. But if we're able to right size it, there's truth. And the truth comes from who God is. If there's no hope, then we're missing something out on the role of faith, and I believe the activity of God in our lives. The hope doesn't come from me. The hope comes from who God is and who God has created me to be, and the power of the redemptive partnership.
I want to prepare you for something, Dr. Miller. I'm going to steal that concept. Okay, I'm going to give you permission. I'm going to give you, what's that called? I'm going to give you credit the first time, and then the second time I'm going to remember giving you credit, and the third time it's all mine. So I'm preparing you. This right sizing
Thank you.
Right size it. I'm all over. I've got a video coming out on that. But Dr. Miller, I can't be the first person to tell you that you are so clear-minded about all of this. As is often the case when I do a podcast with someone that is so eloquent, so clear-headed, so encouraging, I got to have you. I was going to try to squeeze in one more idea, but rather than squeeze, our producer Katie is going to smile at this. She's going to heard me do this before. We're going to invite him back. But the inviting you back, what I want you to do, can we have you back to talk about how does this all translate into healing for the couple? How does this,
Absolutely.
how in the world do we help? How do we bring a disclosure to the wife? What does a disclosure look like? What's the timing for that? What's the role of a polygraph? What's the role of community-based help? What happens after they leave faithful and true? So I've got like 10 more questions, and I can't fit them into 1 minute, and I shouldn't fit them into 1 minute. So can we have you back,
Absolutely.
please?
I would love that. And what I may do is bring one of the females from our staff, either Deb Laser or my wife, because that will bring the context of what it looks like for there to be couples recovery.
I love it. But in kind of summary, everything you've said, by the way, everybody listening, everything Dr. Miller has said translates not only in the field of sexual addiction, but in the field of narcissistic and emotional abuse. I'm just taking all of that stuff, the awareness, transparency, ownership, intentionality. Got it. We're going to weave that into our programming. But anyway, but not to steal your thunder, Dr. Miller, thank you so much for being here today, Dr. Miller. It's been a pleasure. Listeners, as always, if any of this resonates with you, please know we are available to help you find more information about the Marriage Recovery Center, certainly about Faithful and True Ministries in our show description. And we'll make sure to include information about Dr. Miller, as well as if you enjoyed today's show, please give it a 5-star rating and be sure to subscribe to our channel to be notified of the next time we're going to have Dr. Miller back, which is going to be very, very soon. Dr. Miller, thank you so very much. Everything you've shared today applies to everyone that I'm working with as well, and it's great to lock arms. So again, everyone, thank you for tuning in, and we will talk again very soon. Take care, and God bless everyone.